We often talk about how important it is to get your exposures correct, and rightly so. Correct exposure is fundamental to the creation of good images. There's no question, it's page one, day one of cinematography. We make sure to always have a light meter with us to ensure that what we're intending to commit to film is as intended. Today, we have powerful new tools like false color and waveforms to check our values as well. We can easily make sure, even by just looking at monitors, that our brightness and our contrast is exactly the way that we want it to be. But we don't live in the black and white era anymore. With little exception, color is integral to our work. It's easy to think in terms of production design and costumes as being what gives an image its color, and today many seem to believe that it's simply a few dials that you can spin and resolve to get the look you want. It isn't. But there's something as fundamental as exposure that is vital to the modern cinematographer, and that is understanding your light sources. Before the 90s, most lighting was basically tungsten or daylight. HMIs didn't happen until the 80s or so, with carbon arcs coming well before them. And we didn't use fluorescent lighting until Kino Flow came out a little later, because they gave off a pretty nasty green or magenta shift and would tend to flicker. So for the longest time, we basically had amber and blue as our colors, and that was it. You could throw corrective gel on there to match one source to another relatively simply, or you could add party gels to make those lights look red or blue, or green, or whatever color you wanted. But you generally, math was kind of simple, you know, I'm shooting on daylight stock, tungsten will look amber, daylight will look white. Done. Obviously that's oversimplified, but the point I'm trying to make is that things have gotten much more complicated today. There are hundreds of manufacturers from cinema lines to household names that are making lights, and now that cameras are so sensitive, we can use almost any kind of light to expose our images. This means that we have to be hyper vigilant about the quality of those lights. Now, it's easy to think, oh, this light says it's 5600 Kelvin, daylight is 5600 Kelvin, set my camera to 56 and we're off to the races, right? Everything is going to match. But that's making a lot of assumptions, isn't it? Your current sunlight might not be 5600. Is it cooler or warmer maybe? Is the bulb accurate to what it says on the box? Or is it off by a few hundred Kelvin and kind of green or magenta? How would you know? There's no false color for color temperature. And even if you catch it on set, probably a little late there, wouldn't you say? How would you know what to fix, what to change to fix it? What if you have to match the sun or a different source to the lights you brought with you? Are you just going to keep guessing with gels until it matches? That seems kind of ridiculous. Prior to LEDs and even fluorescence, you could use something like the old Minolta color meter, and those would give you a reading of the color temperature of any given source. And then after consulting your gels, doing a little bit of math, you could make things match. You could even make the assumption that tungsten bulbs were all pretty much the same color because of science. Lights back then were all just kind of the same. The problem today is that even if things are accurate on the Kelvin scale, from amber to blue, lights can vary wildly from north to south, making them look magenta or green. And a normal color meter doesn't have a way to know that, just by virtue of the way that they work. So, going back a bit, the International Commission on Illumination, which of course is a Swedish organization, or CIE, came up with the Cri scale. This was a method of testing the accuracy of a given light source, giving said light a score from 1 to 100 as it compares to daylight or a black body illuminant, which basically just means a theoretical perfect object that rejects all light and changes color when it gets hot, like a tungsten filament. But that's also where we get Kelvin as a measurement, because, you know, low heat, like fire, is orange, and high heat, like a butane torch, is blue, right? So CRI looked at 8 low saturation color patches from the Farnsworth-Munsell hue test, eventually boosted up to 15 in 1995, but even that higher range isn't used in the average generally, so whatever, to determine whether or not a light produced color accurately using human vision as the intended metric. This is fine, but it was never intended to evaluate more modern lights like LEDs, and also doesn't take into account the camera as the viewer. It is also a relatively broad test which manufacturers can game and say, look, yay, we've got a really high CRI, when in reality the light only tests well on those 8 patches because that's how they built it. LEDs and some other lights can have really narrow bands of color that show up as spikes on a spectrograph that the CRI test won't catch. So in other words, CRI is probably best used for home applications like evaluating if a bulb will look good in your kitchen. Plus, this thing CRI came out in like 1931, so it's due for an update anyway. So then we've got the TCLI, or the Television Lighting Consistency Index. This tests the accuracy of lights based on a standard color chart, like you can get at Film Tools, so great, but uses a 3 CCD camera as the viewer to determine the accuracy. To quote from the EBU, in November of 2012, the EBU Technical Committee approved a recommendation designed to give technical aid to broadcasters who intended to assess new lighting equipment or to reassess the colorimetric quality of lighting in their television production environment. This recommendation was developed by the LED Lights Project Group under the EBU Strategic Program on Beyond HD. Rather than assess the performance of a luminaire directly, as is done in the Color Rendering Index, CRI, the TCLI mimics a complete television camera and display using only those specific features of cameras and displays which affect color performance. So, end of quote. Okay, cool. But as mentioned, it uses a 3 chip camera, which includes prisms, glass prisms, as its observer, and these days we're almost all using single chip cameras. Pro Video's own Art Adams wrote an article a while back testing whether or not this mattered, seeming to conclude that functionally it didn't. But even so, the Academy thought that in 2016 that they needed to come up with something. So they came up with SSI, the Spectral Similarity Index. According to them, the Spectral Similarity Index addresses issues with existing indices such as the Color Rendering Index and the Television Lighting Consistency Index that make them inappropriate to describe lighting for digital cinema cameras. Issues that have become more evident with the emergence of solid-state lighting such as LEDs. SSI is not based on human vision nor any particular real or idealized camera and does not assume particular spectral sensitivities. Rather, it quantitatively compares the spectrum of the test light with that of a desired reference light source, expressing that similarity as a single number on a scale up to 100, which would indicate a perfect match. High values indicate predictable rendering by most cameras, as well as the quality of visual appearance. Low values may produce good colors with a particular camera, but not with others. SSI is useful for cinematography, television, still photography, and human vision. So, dope. End of quote there, by the way. So, excellent. Now we have ways to not only evaluate a light source, but more accurately match it to other or known sources. Between TCLI and SSI, one can be pretty sure of the verisimilitude of a light, and we even have TM-30 which 18 being the most current standard at the time of this writing, which basically shows a light's accuracy as a circle over a hue chart, and if it's perfectly in line with the reference circle, you've got a perfect light. It'll show you where the skews are by changing the shape of the measured circle to kind of an oblong shape, with little arrows that show where the light is skewing based on the hue. It's pretty nifty, and it uses 99 reference patches over CRI's paltry 15, so it's far more nuanced. So, big question is obviously, how do you measure any of this? Well, basically you got one option, and it's a Sekonic C800. You can also get a C7000, but it has some stuff you wouldn't really need as a cinematographer, and it's way more expensive. So this thing costs $1,600, which is not cheap, but it's also the only tool that can illuminate this massive blind spot we all have when it comes to lighting. Name one time you've only used one type of lighting fixture on set. Hell, you can't even buy regular tungsten bulbs anymore in California, so practical lights are likely going to be LED. At any given moment, you may have 3 to 15 different lights affecting your scene. Of course, you can eyeball it, but that only works so well, and wouldn't you rather be sure? You'd be hard-pressed to find a cinematographer alive today who doesn't rely on their light meter or some form of exposure evaluation tool. So why would you leave the accuracy of your light sources up to chance? Setting any LED panel to 5600 will almost never yield that result. Good ones get close, obviously, but there's no need to guess. And of course, you can use the white balance function on your camera in conjunction with a gray card to measure a given light's white balance and even tint bias in some cases, like my C500. But what about if you have multiple sources? Are you going to do that with all of them? No. The wonderful thing about the C800 and what caused me to buy one is that you can measure all of your lights, compare them, store that info, and even save the graphs to a computer, all the info, the readouts, and reference it later. Not only do you get detailed readouts, spectrums, and graphs for the lights you're measuring, giving you a solid understanding of what the light you intend to use is doing to your image, but the thing even tells you what gels to use to match one light to another. You can compare 2 or 4 lights, and with the 4 light feature, you just select which source is the hero fixture, and it'll tell you what gels to use to match that to the other, or to match the other 3 to that. You can also get XY coordinates from a measurement and put those into, say, a sky panel to match the light exactly with just a few twirls of the 2 dials. And of course, knowing exactly what color temperature any given light is gives you so much more power when lighting a scene. Sure, you can put 3200 Kelvin in the back of your LED panel, but until you measure it, how would you know? You know, you don't know what's actually coming out of the front of that thing. In a lot of cases, it can be 200, 300 Kelvin off, or even worse. Instead of having one room all looking like it's lit by a single source, it'll look like multiple ever so slightly different ones. And, you know, hey, maybe your head won't notice, but your heart will. So imagine you just walk onto your set, say a classic corporate interview. You measure the ambient color, the color temperature, you set your LED panel accordingly by measuring as you adjust or gel if you don't have a bicolor or RGB fixture. And it's just spot on, you're done. Or you're walking through the store, you can meter every single available light and judge which one's best for you without falling prey to marketing bullshit. Maybe you just want to replicate the color of a light that you like. So you meter it, save it into your memory, bring it up later, and match something else to it when it's time. Hell, I walked around my neighborhood and just metered various patches of sun and shade towards the end of golden hour just to see how it changed and what that looked like scientifically. So now I can easily replicate that with no guesswork. And as G.I. Joe said, knowing is half the battle. So to wrap this up, I highly recommend you get a modern color meter if you're planning on taking cinematography as a career seriously, or if you're already in the trenches and you just didn't realize that there was this whole hidden world of variability in lighting that you had to pay attention to now. You know, if we want to fight against the whole fix it and post movement, let's make sure they don't have to, huh? So that's all I have to talk about. I just wanted to tell you about it and the wonders of a good color meter and how the scientifically minded among us can be so fulfilled by knowing instead of guessing. That's it. So take care.